Dermo. I'm with you until 9:30 today. And then we've got a compilation of our 100 years of Scottish stories. You know, the ones that we've been peppering throughout lots of different programmes across this year. Well, we've got really, really special stories to tell you this morning. And they're all based on, you guessed it, a wartime theme. Really, really touching war stories in there, actually worth a listen. So that's going to be between 9:30 this morning and 10 o'clock. And then after 9, speaking of that actually, we've got a really special interview I did earlier on in the week with Reverend Angus Smith, right, who served as a padre to the Scots Guards in the Falklands conflict 40 years ago this year. Some really reflective moments and quite life-affirming moments, I think, from someone reflecting on a very, very difficult time in his life and career, and also just what he learned from people when they're faced with extreme fear. So that's going to be just after 9 o'clock this morning. Before that, though, we're going to be picking through the fallout. You just heard about it on the news there from Linda, about the US midterm elections. What it means, I guess, for us here in the UK, but also we're going to be looking a little bit more into the role that religion and spirituality has had to play actually for the battle for democracy over in the United States. I think it's quite a good indicator, maybe, you might agree or disagree with us, as to where we are in the rest of the world. So we're going to be picking through that in some detail. We'll reflect on the passing, you might have heard this earlier in the week, of the former Archbishop of Glasgow, Mario Conti, one of the most senior figures of the Catholic Church in Scotland over the past few years. So we'll be looking back on his life and his career. And in a moment, what makes a hero? And specifically, what makes a spiritual or religious hero, or heroine for that matter? We're going to be delving into that after this, a classic from Dionne Warwick. Dionne Warwick and What the World Needs Now. It's 8:10 on Sunday morning. It's Connie with you until 9:30 today. Now, here's a question for you. What makes a hero? Right? They always don't necessarily come with capes, as many of us will know, but why are we asking that question on a Sunday morning? Well, today is the first day of Scottish Interfaith Week, right? And as part of that, one event which caught our eye was a workshop called Scriptural Reasoning, What Makes a Hero. So we thought, let's explore that in a little bit more detail, this idea of what makes someone extraordinary, so much so that we would call them a hero. Here to chat more about that with me is Katie Sproul, project leader at Glasgow Interfaith, who's also facilitating that discussion actually that we're talking about on Tuesday. Morning to you, Katie.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. We've also got Dr. David Goodman, a member of the Jewish Reform community. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning, Connie. Good to be here again.
Yeah, it's really good to have you on. I think the best place to start, and I'm going to ask you both the same question, is how do we define a hero or heroine? Katie, let me ask you that first.
Well, there's lots of traits and values, I think, that come to mind when it comes to defining heroes and heroines. I think one of the obvious ones is bravery or courage, but that doesn't need to be bravery in battles or fights. It can be just simply doing the right thing in a context where that's difficult. I think compassion and kindness, I think strength as well. And I don't just mean physical strength, although that can definitely be the case, but emotional strength, resilience, and spiritual strength as well, as we look at some of the figures from faith.
David?
Yeah, I agree. A hero is a person who, in the opinion of others, has done something special, has an ability or a personal quality, and is regarded as a role model or an ideal. It could be a musician, an artist, a sportsman. It could even be a parent or teacher. Somebody who has carried out courageous acts of nobility or character. There are lots of different ways of looking at this.
They sound pretty amazing and pretty special people. And I think maybe what we all try, or most of us will try and strive to be like. I was just having a look there. I put into Google, right, what makes a hero? And what it came up with, in all its wisdom, right, was empathy and compassion for others. That seems quite simplistic, though, David, and in terms of it, just because I guess people would strive to be empathetic and compassionate in all different walks of life, but you wouldn't necessarily turn around and say, "Oh, they're a hero."
Well, I think it's true to say that one person's hero is not always another's. Heroes are very personal things. So, if you walk down the street and ask people who are your heroes, they're going to come up with all sorts of different identify heroes or heroines, depending on their view on world. Another aspect of heroism is, I would say, selflessness, lack of ego, humility, somebody who's got a sense of the bigger picture and acts accordingly, and often will be unrecognized as being a hero.
Katie, what was it about this topic that made you think, right, I want to have a conversation about this in a bit more detail?
Well, as you said, this week's Scottish Interfaith Week, and the general theme is storytelling. We wanted to look at and share good stories, and this led us to think about great moments from Scripture and then heroes. It's a universal theme, we think. It's something that's present across all faiths and belief traditions. You're going to find hero figures, really, whatever you're reading or whatever you're hearing, there's going to be somebody inspiring. And we also just thought it's quite an engaging and exciting discussion topic. As you said earlier, superheroes don't all wear capes. Some people are very familiar with the ones that do, and some people are familiar with hearing everyday heroes in the news, and we think that can be quite a moving topic.
I sometimes think that it would be nice if we heard more about these particular stories, because we hear an awful lot about the difficulties and the difficult things that happen across the world, and we need to know about these in our news stories, and we cover that a lot on right across the BBC. But sometimes, as David, as you were saying there, the people who maybe we should be learning from, we're not hearing an awful lot about, or we're not hearing about these acts of heroism. Why do you think that is?
It doesn't always make news. There are some, and I agree with Katie that there should be universal heroes. People like Nelson Mandela, for example.
Yeah.
Most people would agree that he was a hero. But there are, and the other thing that just sprang to mind is that during the honors list that is produced every year, there are people who are awarded for great acts of charity, often very well-known people who have done selflessly considerable works of good works. As part of their payback to society that most people don't know about until they get recognized for a CBE or an MBE or whatever it is. So it does happen. There is a concept in Judaism called Lamed Vav, which is 36 humble, righteous people, most of them unknown, who sustain the world. And these people are hidden. This is mysticism. Nobody knows who they are. They themselves may not know who they are. And there is this, I think, universal concept that a lot of the great works of heroism in terms of selflessness and lack of ego and humility go unrecognized because the people who are doing them are not seeking to be heroes. Whereas, some of the more courageous acts of leadership, warrior acts, the people who wear the capes, as we're talking about, they're out there and they want to be known as heroes.
That's a really interesting point, David. And Katie, it would be interesting to get your thoughts on that, about what David's saying there about maybe this idea of heroism is almost the pathway to spirituality. No matter what faith that you belong to or you believe in, would that be fair?
I think so. And I think that's one of the massive benefits of something like scriptural reasoning, where you're coming together to explore text, not just from your culture or faith, but from the faiths of others as well. It gives you an opportunity to kind of get to know other figures you've maybe never heard of before, and figures that you might just really find inspiring and moving, and will maybe make you do some good in the world, and they don't need to be from your own faith. Also, it's quite interesting because at scriptural reasoning, sometimes people who belong to that faith still come along and still learn something new. So it can definitely be a way to kind of delve in a little bit deeper. And I think looking at some of the really exemplary people from the faith are just a great way to kind of get to know the faith itself.
When we were having a conversation about this during the week with the team, and the first... this probably sums me up. The first thing that came to my mind was about the animal heroes that you hear about. So obviously today's Remembrance Sunday, and you think about the war horses, the dogs, the animals that have embody all of those qualities that we've been speaking about, and they just do it out of sheer sort of love for the person they're connected to. And sometimes we forget it's not necessarily, Katie, almost always humans, and we can learn a lot, I guess, from other species as well, it would seem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at faiths, you can definitely have, people who existed, or you could have deities as well, spiritual beings, physically existed, I should have said. And then, of course, as you said, animals. If you think about nowadays, people wear purple poppies to remember the war animals. And then even if we're looking at the sort of superhero figure versus the everyday figure, you could even compare that to service animals, or animals that help people, companions for physical or emotional support. That can be heroic.
David, who's your hero?
I have several heroes, and it varies from day to day. So my heroes include people like Eric Cantona, the footballer,
wow.
Leonard Cohen, Baal Shem Tov, who was a Jewish leader in the 18th century, and at a personal level, my parents and my Aunt Margot, who inspired me greatly when I was younger and still does.
Katie, Eric Cantona as well?
Well, like David said, I have to say my parents as well, of course. But then there's quite a few people that I admire. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist leader who was at the forefront of social engaged Buddhism. Marsha P. Johnson, the leader of the gay liberation movement, one of those leaders. And also looking again at this sort of idea of the lesser known hero, a Sikh author and activist called Simranjit Singh, who's the first children's author to publish a book about a Sikh main character in a major publishing house. And I got the pleasure of interviewing him a couple of Scottish Interfaith weeks ago. And what I find heroic about him is the fact that he's putting out his passion and increasing representation for a younger generation as well.
You said there about obviously my parents. I don't necessarily know if that is obvious, and I think it's nice that both of you mentioned that, because, and we maybe don't always think about our parents in that way, and it's only maybe sometimes when we reflect back, or as we get older, we think, wow, what have they done for us?
Well, not everybody's parents are heroes. I
exactly.
think
no, that's absolutely true. Listening to David say that, I was like, yes, I resonate with that, but it won't be the case for everyone.
No. It won't be. Listen, just a final point on this, Katie, just on the actual event itself. What are you hoping that people take away?
Well, I'm hoping that people will broaden their horizon. As I said, it's an opportunity to learn a little bit more about not just your own faith, but the faiths of others. But really, what I love about this type of event is discovering people's similarities and the similarities in the text. You kind of don't realize how similar religions can be, but the stories often really have very similar messages, even if they're very different sort of styles of stories. The idea of taking care of others, reverence for the earth and the beings that inhabit it, it really occurs across all faiths. And as I said, inspiring figures, whether human or deity, they're dotted around these texts and stories.
Lovely. Looking forward to hearing more about that, Katie. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us this morning. And David, always great to hear from you as well. And I'll be honest, you surprised me. I wasn't expecting the Cantona line, but this is why I love to do this programme. I never quite know where we're going to go next.
I gave you a mixture there.
Gave you a mixture. I love that. That's what we want. Okay, good to chat to you both. The workshop, by the way, that Katie's talking about there, What Makes a Hero, is on Tuesday the 15th of November at 6 o'clock. You can find out more information about that by visiting the Scottish Interfaith Week website. You are listening to Sunday Morning with me, Connie McLaughlin. That's something to think about maybe for this morning. Who's your hero? Who's someone that actually embodies all of those qualities that we've been talking about? This idea of humility, this idea of compassion, empathy, and doing things maybe when other people aren't watching. Something to consider. Let's get a little bit more music for you. 8:23. This is Simon.
Yo, this is something coming from the non-juice. Another fat track, so rhythm deep on the oceans. And let's relax, I'll sip it on yak because it's like that. I'm conscious of foes, so pick up on this book, I like it. I will protect you for the skin, I say the whole trench. From row C to yo, I know she's on the 9 inch. Just to get a piece of piggery, but she's an undertaker. Not know where that paper is around the world. Heartbreaker, make me sick, I feel for yo. Had to have a breakdown, paying you fools, so now you know. While my belly's round, picking it right back up and scooping across the back of stool shovel. Not from the ghetto, but yo, take me to another level. Let the beat ride, but hold on to your woman G, cause now that I'm rich, so many women wanna do me and make a man say, damn. I'm finally texting more than your homie Sam. Now let me speak for the week, I mean the rookies. My time is held up extremely for cookies. Just let me block this grip in 92. And you don't bother me and I sure never won't bother you. And you just watch a brother forward like Niagara. Think before you step because these niggas is rich like ya. Although one label with the black fade is gold D's on my phone and gold legs, cause I got it made. I broke the beat once again because I had to. And just like 30 Rocky, baby girl, I can hide. You just let me work this talking, yo. Anyway, it's okay. You'll play some mine all night until the next day. Do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Just do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Just do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Just do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Now here we go from the top, second verse of the same song with the conclusion. No should be happy for the ding dong. And since the 9 o'clock a great G, it's like every rhythm that I see be like, do you remember over me. A hustler and it's not over my hoes, the Lego. Keep them chunky like Prego, so rhythm tight on my ego. I have a tendency to flow, start off with my own groove and pick up the mic. And all of a sudden I see high moving, guess it's like magic. And Paperboy is the magician. If I was a vacuum, I'd be sucking up competition. Let it ride again, and you'll believe I got my own thing. Straight behind my hoe, so miss me with the trick of Soul Train. And I'ma break my note, just to show the token. So how does Ash when I scoop it with me blood smoking? A black man trying to make it, and that ain't no fair. But just like the CC, I take you there, hood. Do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Just do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Just do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Just do the ditty if you want to, because then I can see if I want to. Here we go, now let's take a trip to another land, clock a grip. Come back and watch the host, tan, jumping up like so. And roll out to my cabin, believe me, my brother more host than you can imagine. All on the digger-ling, just because the gold rings burn up like a summer choke. You ain't heard a damn thing, make sure you got the gym hat strapped for protection. Because to me, my life is more than my erection. And give me your hand, if you a fan, it ain't over yet. Do what you did with Paperboy, makes the ocean sweat. Keep it kinda started like the funk off of Frito. Make your man jealous while hoes chickens like Doritos. It ain't my fault, I laid a Bible with concern. And I ain't from Mount Vernon, but our brothers money earning. And don't disagree, and then jockers, that's a pity. Just bob your head for Paperboy and the Diddy. Yeah.
On BBC Radio Scotland.
We focus on the Scottish music scene, so we feature a lot of Scottish artists and bands. When we play the big names likes of U2 or the Rolling Stones or David Bowie, I always like to try and go into each band's back catalogue. Social media completely and utterly amazes me. I mean, I always get a big thrill when I play a record and literally within 2 or 3 minutes somebody comes on and says, "What was that record? How can I get it?"
Billy Sloan, Saturday night from 10 on BBC Radio Scotland.
It's 8:26. You are listening to Sunday Morning with me, Connie McLaughlin, on this Remembrance Sunday. Coming up about 9:30. So I am with you. Normally, as you'll know, this programme's on till 10 o'clock, but this morning it's on till 9:30 because we've got a special programme presented by Michelle McManus that brings together loads of your stories from our, the 100 Years of Scottish Stories, the collection that we've been doing right throughout this year about sort of different people's lives and how they've grown up within Scotland, and loads of different variations of those Scottish stories. But this morning we've got more of a wartime theme, people's memories, people's reflections on their own experiences or experiences of people maybe within their family. It's a lovely little half hour, and it's really worth a listen before 10 o'clock, and then the Sunday show kicks off as normal. A little bit later in this hour we're going to be talking about the US midterm elections. You heard Linda a little bit earlier, just at 8 o'clock, talking about this in the news and how things might be changing from a Democrats' perspective in terms of the Senate, just given what's happened in Nevada this morning already. So we're going to be talking about that, and I guess what that means in a bigger context for us in the UK, but also what it means from a democracy perspective in terms of spirituality and how religion plays a part within that as well. So really interesting conversation with two brilliant guests. Greg Garrett, you might remember, he's been on this programme lots of times before, and Professor Christopher Carman. So they're coming up just in about 10-15 minutes time, so stick around if you can for that. Now, it was announced last week that Mario Conti, the Emeritus Archbishop of Glasgow, died at the age of 88 following a short illness. You might have also seen that actually in the news. He was Glasgow's 9th Archbishop and among the longest serving in the UK. His name will be synonymous with Catholicism, I think, in Glasgow for a very, very long time. And he's one of the last surviving bishops in the world to have been appointed by Pope, now St. Paul VI, a really long time ago. So we're going to be reflecting back on his life with Ian Dunn, who's the managing editor of the Scottish Catholic magazine. Good morning to you, Ian.
Good morning, Connie.
Reflect, if you will, on a life of lengthy service. I think that's fair to say.
No, absolutely. It's remarkable to think he became a priest, before the Second Vatican Council in the 60s, when we were still saying Mass in Latin, and to go all the way through 64 years to today, and the changes in the world, changes in the church, is remarkable. But I think it's quite fair to say that he himself remained very much himself through that period. He was very warm, funny guy, very socially adept, not above a bit of name dropping from time to time or without ego, but very good in a whole range of social situations. And I think that's why the tributes have been so heartfelt this week.
It's interesting that you say that about the name dropping, right? Because is it something that we forget that actually people of service, people who are part of the church, are also human beings and not necessarily always without fault?
No, absolutely. I mean, who among us is, But yeah, absolutely. He's like anyone else, he had his faults, But I think I've been speaking to a lot of people this week who knew him well. What they remember is something that came up a lot, was just a great dinner party guest. Someone who was very good company. And was quite witty, and called the first volume of his autobiography "Oh Help," which does suggest a certain self-awareness.
And you're right, 64 years is an awful long time. So he was studied in both Italy and in Scotland, but in the Vatican. What do we sort of know about those earlier years, Ian, and I guess how the person that you grew to know was sort of formed at that time?
So, he was born in Elgin, very much to the northeast of Italian parents from Barga, with his long-standing connections to Scotland. And I think he carried with the Italian side in the northeast with him throughout his life, if quite likely. I think one of and he said he always wanted to be a priest from as early as he can remember, and he was of that era where he was packed off to seminary, 12 years old, something like that. So, for almost all of that long life, the church and the priesthood were central, and his long service as a priest is one thing, but as a bishop is particularly unusual, as you said, one of the last to be appointed by St. Paul. But also, he was bishop when John Paul II came to Scotland for a papal visit, and when Benedict in 2010 came to Scotland. And in hindsight, it feels like that period between those two papal visits was a window for Catholics in Scotland, where the sectarian of the past had faded a bit. Scotland wasn't as secular as it is now, so there was an opportunity for the Catholic Church to engage with Scottish society, and that was something he was particularly adept at and particularly keen on.
How instrumental was he in those visits, actually? Because I was reading a little bit about that, and there was a lot of work happening behind the scenes that maybe a lot of people wouldn't have known about.
Oh, enormous! I mean, as one of the bishops, he was key to overseeing the organisation of them. I mean, at that first visit of John Paul II, the Mass at Bellahouston Mark is still the biggest public event in Scottish history, 300,000 people. So I mean, you can only imagine the amount of logistical. I mean, the health and safety regs probably weren't quite where they are now, but even so, the amount of effort to get that event organised and happening successfully is, almost unthinkable.
What do you think in terms of maybe, so that aside, and I'm thinking more about, he did a lot of work for the renovation of St Andrew's Cathedral as well, and lots of different projects that I guess you wouldn't necessarily people might not necessarily know about either.
Yes, well, I think the church generally does a lot of things. There's a lot of things involved in the Catholic Church that aren't always obvious from the outside. But he was very much someone who, who would go in a lot of different directions, a wide range of interests, was a great, patron of the arts, was, was keen on being a representative of the Scots Italian community, and I think that renovation in particular is a particularly important one. That you could almost get a Netflix series out of that, from what I understand, because I think it was a huge task, £5 million, an enormous went over budget, and the kind of centrepiece of it was he commissioned Peter Howson, the artist, to do this huge image of St John Ogilvie, Scotland's only martyr, who was executed just up the road, a few hundred feet away from the cathedral. And I think the original version, it was meant to be the biggest crowd scene ever created. And then when it was almost finished, Peter Howson, being a temperamental artist, destroyed it. But the version that he did complete, that now hangs in the cathedral, that is in the cathedral, is still a remarkable piece of art, and he was, Archbishop Conte was a great believer in the power of art to bring people to God. And I think in that renovation, and particularly in that picture, he did it, that, he might well have achieved that.
We I touched on it a little bit at the start of our conversation about his controversies at times. In particular, I guess his stance on gay marriage was very strong, and for, I guess, him, and maybe looking back at the way that I think in his words, the insensitivity perhaps surrounding the historical child sexual abuse cases, he wasn't short of controversies throughout his life, but with that and within that, what do you believe part of his legacy will be?
I think particularly on the abuse crisis, like so many bishops of that generation, he didn't handle it particularly well. He said to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry that he was ashamed of how he'd responded to some of the people who came forward, didn't always take it as seriously, and he will have to account for that. But looking at the whole of his life, I think the relationships and the love which we've seen this week, and which he's held, is part of it. But I do also think that painting in St Andrew's Cathedral in Glasgow, centuries from now, people will walk along the Clyde and look into the cathedral and see that painting and maybe get a wee glimpse of the kind of terrifying strangeness of the mercy of God. And that will be down to Archbishop Mario.
And thinking back, or thinking forward rather, about what happens next, and I guess where the Catholic faith is heading within Scotland, do you think it's in a healthier position given the work that he's done?
In some ways, I think latterly, he did, along with the bishops, they did realise the severity of the abuse, and a lot of work has gone into addressing that and putting safeguarding in place, which was started by him and carried on by many others. I think, I do think that there was a window, between those papal visits where the church engaged with society. I think we're probably in a different stage now, where religion is much more of a minority pursuit, and we need different skills and different people to address that, But he was, given his longevity, he was also very aware of the longevity of the church. So, the church changes, it evolves over time to adapt the situation that it's in, but while still remaining fundamentally itself. So I'm sure that he would be very confident that the church in Scotland will continue for many hundreds of years, espousing many of the things that he did.
Ian, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Connie.
That was Ian Dunn reflecting on the life of Archbishop Mario Conte. It's 8:37 here on BBC Radio Scotland. It is Sunday morning with me, Connie McLaughlin. We are with you, and I'm with you until 9:30 today, because it is Remembrance Sunday. I won't need to remind you of that. We are then taking you to a really special programme with Michelle McManus. I think I mentioned this earlier. It's going to be a compilation of lots of different stories and memories, and a chance, I guess, for you to reflect back on your own memories, perhaps members of your family, perhaps who it's a special day for you to remember them. So that's going to be between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. Now, we are halfway through the negotiations at COP27. It started last week in Egypt. One of the hot topics this year is just how the world's wealthier nations are going to help those developing countries hit hardest by climate change. You might remember last week we tried to get hold of Leah Zakharib, who's an activist and environmental scientist from Lebanon. She was invited over to COP27 by the Scottish Government to be part of the Climate Youth Negotiations programme. We had a little bit of issue with her line, but I believe that we've got her back this morning. I'm pleased to say. Leah, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Hi. Good
Great.
morning.
Fabulous. I'm really glad that we can get a chance to speak to you. How has your week been?
Well, I have to say it was extremely interesting. So it's been a long week, but yesterday we had the plenary. So it was the closing plenary for. Hello?
Oh, yep. Are you still there?
Yeah. I'm there. Sorry. So yesterday we had the plenary for to end the week, and it was a bit disappointing, I have to say, at least for everyone that was observing, because the main topics that everyone wants to reach consensus on is loss and damage and adaptation, or at least the goals for adaptation, financing mechanisms for both of these topics, which are crucial for Pacific Islands, which are crucial for least developing countries. And the only agreement that happened yesterday after 1 week of negotiation was on reporting mechanisms and reporting guidelines, while these topics that are really important, there was no consensus whatsoever, so they were pushed to next week.
Right. So effectively no cold hard cash given out and no real agreement in terms of any I guess help or assistance or additional help and assistance for these countries that are hit hardest. Do you have any feeling or hope that this is going to be resolved and that next week actually we might see something different?
Well, everyone, all of the chairs and the presidency, they're really insisting on having something out of this COP because it's taking place in Africa and it is COP for implementation. So there's a lot of political will and political push for there to be a decision, at least, on something. Especially, I mean, one of my colleagues from Tonga yesterday, we were in the room discussing loss and damage, and we were getting pushback on financing loss and damage. And while we were in the room, they got a notice for a 6.7 earthquake back home. So it's not really a matter of I don't know how to put it in a very diplomatic way. I think I exhausted my diplomatic battery through the week. It's these people, some islands or some countries, they don't have the time. I know we say that all the time, but I mean, while we're in negotiations, people are moving to different areas so they can actually avoid certain catastrophic damages. So there's a lot of pressure on the presidency to move things forward. So I hope so. I hope we get something next week.
Just a final point before we let you go. We are reflecting on Remembrance Sunday here in the UK today. And part of that, I guess, is remembering and respecting other human beings and how we can be better at doing that. Maybe a day like today here in the UK is a time where we have a moment to think about how we can respect each other and reflect on that a little bit better. Do you get the sense at COP27 that there is an element of respect from these other countries or from these other organisations who have the power to make change?
Yeah, I have to say, honestly, because outside of the negotiation rooms, when you talk to people, even people that are or countries that are blocking the way forward, they're just representing a governmental agenda. So as people, everyone wants to do something. there's not one person with a scientific background, a heart, or has any faith whatsoever moving forward that doesn't want to um, try to help all of these developing countries, including, I mean, my country and the countries of pretty much everyone in the negotiation program. And they do have a sense of duty, a sense of obligation that we need to move things forward, we need to take action. But it's there's a lot of politics involved. So the people do want to, and the will is there, the intention is there. It's just a matter of politics getting in the way. So hopefully next week we're gonna get a little bit less of that, because the presidency and the chairs yesterday they straight out said that they were disappointed that they didn't reach agreement on this. Mr. Simon Steele, the secretary, I mean, he pretty much said, we're disappointed, we didn't get anywhere on loss and damage, we didn't get anywhere on adaptation. I urge parties to huddle in small groups, talk to each other, not only use formal channels. They really want something to be resolved out of this, because like I mentioned, things are happening in real time while we're here in COP, just kind of like debating wordplay. So.
Yeah, and I guess that must be the frustration for an awful lot of people, that the moment and the time for talking seems to be running very, very thin. Leah, thank you so much. I'm really glad that we managed to get a chance to speak to you this morning.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely speaking to you.
Yeah, Leah Zagreb there, who's an environmental scientist from Lebanon, who is a delegate at the COP27 summit in Egypt this morning. Really interesting just to get her take. And that idea of Leah saying that actually she does feel as if there's respect between all parties, which is actually quite, it's nice to hear that. I think it's quite, it makes you feel as if there's maybe a little bit of hope for these conversations as they continue in Egypt. 8:45 here in BBC Radio Scotland. Now, Leah was talking there about politics sometimes getting in the way. Just have a chat to people in America and maybe then that might be a little bit more apparent, because last week's Americans headed to the polls for the midterm elections, the first major test of President Joe Biden's leadership, with America continuing to be divided along issues like race, religion, politics, as we've mentioned. I think we're asking the question this morning, what do these elections actually say about the state of democracy in the US? And I guess the bigger question is maybe what direction American society might be taking. Here to chat more about this morning is Greg Garrett, Professor of Literature and Culture at Baylor University. Morning to you, Greg. Good to have you back.
Good morning, Connie. It's always good to be on with you on Remembrance Sunday.
Yes, I know, and I'm glad to have you with me. We've also got Professor Christopher Carman Stevenson, Professor of Citizenship at the University of Glasgow. Morning to you, Christopher.
Morning.
It's nice to have you both. I wish I had you closer to me in the studio so I could have a look at you eye to eye. But I think that this is such an important conversation, and it's interesting that even this morning, Greg, this situation is developing even further with what's happening. We saw in Nevada.
Yeah. It is a very interesting year, and I'm sure Professor Carman can tell us a lot more about this. But one of the